Alright, in this video, I want to talk about the elections in Vienna. Now, Vienna is, of course, the capital of Austria, but is also the largest city in the country and actually its own state. Similar to Berlin or Bremen in Germany, there are 9 federal states, federal Bundesländer, inside Austria, and Vienna is one of those states. So it is a city, but is also technically, on a political level, operates as a state, and it is the largest of all of the Austrian states with around 1.9 million people. And this election, of course, is directly affecting the city or the state of Vienna itself, but of course, since it's representing around 2 million people and an electorate of around 8-9 million people, it is very important to show what the mood is in Austrian politics, at least in Vienna. Now, of course, Vienna being a city has long been a stronghold for the left, the Social Democratic Party, the SPÖ in Austria, but also to some extent the Greens, the Liberal Neos Party. But we also see here that in contrast to other major cities across Europe, especially in Germany, we see that the right-wing Freedom Party does very well here. So this election is, of course, for the state of Vienna, and this is, of course, not going to be a direct reflection of the way Austrian politics are nationwide, or even the way the Austrians in Vienna, the people in Vienna vote for their parliament, because as we've seen in some of these state elections, the way states vote for their state or local offices are very different than the way they vote on the federal level. But I want to take a look at the results and also compare them to what we had on the federal election and also the previous elections in Vienna. Now, the Social Democratic Party came in first place by far with around 39.3% of the vote. They suffered some losses, but very minor losses, only around a few points, lost a few seats, but overall they were able to outperform the polls. The polls had them polling around 37 to 39% of the vote, so they did suffer some minor losses, but they are still clearly in first place, and the SPO will be able to maintain power in this state. They do not have an absolute majority, and by historical means this might be somewhat low, but there are a lot of parties competing in Austrian politics now compared to maybe 20, 30 years ago. And so for the Social Democrats, this is definitely a victory. The party's been struggling at a lot of elections, losing support, and they did lose some here, but 2% out of the 41 they had is definitely a good result for the Austrian Social Democrats. They maintained their strong support in Vienna, and this is, of course, still a stronghold for the party in Austria. It's one of the states that the Social Democrats can heavily rely on, and it is also a very large state. It's not a smaller state. It is a state of, it's the nation's capital. It does have a lot of cultural significance, not only in Austria itself, but across Europe, and it is also around 2 million people. So this does actually give the Social Democrats a lot of power and influence indirectly at the local level, but also through the way that the state government can interact with the federal government. Now, the Austrian People's Party, the ÖVP, suffered a historic loss. They lost around half their vote, falling from 20% to around 9% of the vote. And this meant that they went from the second largest party in the Vienna state parliament to being the 5th largest party. So they have suffered heavy losses, even low, getting below what the polls had showed. Now, the big winner of the night for this election in Vienna was the Austrian Freedom Party. Now, back in 2020, the Austrian Freedom Party suffered a huge loss here after the backlash to the Ibiza scandal, which brought down the federal coalition with the Freedom Party and the People's Party. They dropped around, I believe, around 17 points or something from around 30% of the vote they had. And so the Freedom Party has been able to come back and regain a lot of the support, not to where, not at the level they were in 2015 or 2010 under the leadership of Heinz Christian Strache, which is actually from Vienna and gave them somewhat of a local boost, but they have nonetheless been able to come back. In the previous election, they got around 7%, and this time they nearly tripled the result, getting 20%, and also overtook the Austrian People's Party for second place. So they're now the main opposition in the Vienna State Parliament. They will be one of the main parties challenging the governor, the mayor, the government itself. And this will give them a lot more presence, not only in the city of Vienna itself, but of course it is a major state, it is the capital, so this will be important for national politics. A lot of these elections have been kind of seen as bellwethers because we had the coalition talks after the Freedom Party won the last federal elections, and there was a lot of back and forth between who is going to be the chancellor. And so these elections kind of give us a gauge about what the mood is in Austria. They're kind of like polls. Of course, you have polling for Austria, but these elections kind of show what the Austrian voters are thinking in different areas and can kind of give us an idea of what might happen at the next federal election. But of course, that is still a ways out, definitely a few years until we can even talk about that. The Green Party did decent here, won around 15% of the vote, 14.5. The Greens do very well here because this, of course, is a city, especially in the very urban parts, the very central part of the city. There's a lot of universities, and of course, with young people, they do very well, more progressive, liberal voting base. And so Vienna is one of the states also in Austria where the Green Party can do significantly well, but they did lose some support. They did not grow. They are, at around 15%. There's a few areas where they came in first place, but it's not not as much as some of the cities in Germany like Berlin or Cologne, where the Greens are around 30%. They are very strong here, but definitely overshadowed by the center left of the Social Democrats, the SPO, which has around 40%, clearly above them. The liberal centrist Neos party got around 10% of the vote, a minor increase. They've been able to gain some support here and there in a few elections. And this, of course, being a major city with some of the more progressive, metropolitan voters, they are able to do very well in the urban part, the central part of the city. Some of the more middle class areas, they do even better. And the Freedom Party, of course, got 20%. Like I said, a huge increase in their votes. The Communist Party of Austria got 4% of the vote. They were able to double their vote here. But of course, some states in Austria, the threshold is 4%. But I believe in Vienna it is 5%. So even though they got around 4% of the vote, they will not be getting any seats in the Vienna state parliament, or the Vienna Gemeinderat. And so there we have 5 factions, 5 political groups: the Social Democrats, which had some minor losses; the Freedom Party and the People's Party, which basically switched places. The People's Party, which lost half their support, and the Freedom Party, which basically tripled their support. And then we have the center left Greens and the center Neos, which basically are even around 10 and 15% of the vote. Now, if we take a look at the map, we of course see a lot of red, and this is because the Social Democrats won first place by a large margin, having nearly twice the amount of vote as the second place party, the Freedom Party. But we do see some areas around the city where different parties do well. Some of the outskirts go toward the more right-wing parties, the Freedom Party, the People's Party, and there are some more parts of the city in the very middle that go for the Greens. These are probably areas around universities with a lot of young voters that tend to vote for the Greens. But overall, we can see the SPO's dominance in the city of Vienna here, and we can see this, with this map almost entirely red. Now, if we take a look at the coalition talks, the incumbent government has been a coalition of the Social Democrats and the Neos Party, and they have retained their majority. But what's interesting here is that the Social Democrats actually have an option with any of the other 4 parties. The Social Democrats are, I believe, 7 seats short of a majority. The Vienna Gemeinderat, Vienna State Parliament, has 100 seats, so they need 51 for a majority. And what that basically means is the Social Democrats can pick any of these parties, the People's Party, the Greens, Neos, or the Freedom Party, and we'll have a majority there in Vienna. Now, it's very likely that they will choose to either go with Neos, which gives them a majority, or the Greens, which are somewhat more ideologically similar to. They're both center-left parties. They could also go with the People's Party. There is cooperation. Now, the Social Democrats and the Freedom Party have worked together in many states before, in Burgenland, and I believe in Carinthia in the past. However, Vienna is a state where that's most likely not going to happen. And it really doesn't need to happen because the Social Democrats can reach a majority with the Neos Party or the Austrian People's Party, and with a smaller party, they're going to be, giving away less minister posts, in the state government. And so I believe it'll likely be a continuation of the SPO Neos government. But if they decided to change, they could, have their choices anyway and go with any of the 4 parties and be at a majority there. Now, I want to take a look at this election compared to the Nationalratswahl, the federal election back in September of 2024, to give an idea about how this election is different than the way Vienna might vote on the state, on the federal level. Now, of course, the problem is this election is held at a much different time. This was held in September of 2024, whereas the Vienna elections, of course, are being held in the end of April 2025. So, almost half a year difference between them, and so has been major changes in the polls, but we can see some minor differences. And we saw that Vienna was one of the best state for the Social Democrats in the national elections. However, they only got around 29% of the vote, and one of the reasons it says is because the Social Democrats in Vienna, the Social Democrats in a lot of states, such as Carinthia and Burgenland, have a much more popular, stronger state branch than they do on the federal level. A lot of people trust the Social Democrats maybe more locally. The politicians, they know they are in the local branch more to solve local issues than they do the federal party, which has had some infighting, has some divides in it. And so this is one reason we can see that on the national level, Vienna does vote for the Social Democrats, but around 30%, whereas on the federal level, it's 40%, sometimes 50%, significantly higher than they do for the federal elections. We do see that the Freedom Party is in line with what they got in the previous election. They got around 20.6% of the vote for the federal elections back in September. So they have been able to solidify themselves in second place in Vienna for state and federal elections in the city. And we see the Austrian People's Party is the one that kind of underperformed this election by the most. They got around 17% in Vienna for the federal election in 2024, and this time they only got 9%. Now, arguably, this has to do more with the fact that there was the the problems with the coalition talks. There were a lot of people angry that the People's Party initially ruled out working with the Freedom Party, and maybe some voters saw that they had lost the election and they had lost a lot of support and could no longer trust them to form the next government, maybe shifting over to some other parties, maybe some going to the Freedom Party, maybe some going to Neos. So we get to see that the People's Party has suffered a lot of losses, basically since the collapse of the Sebastian Kurz government after the scandal that brought on his government. The People's Party suffered a lot of losses, and then the Greens and Neos are pretty much in line with what they get in the Vienna and the state election. But Vienna is a very important, very interesting state because it's contrary to many of the rural states. It is a state where you have a clear divide between a lot of parties. In some states, the People's Party or the Social Democrats are clearly ahead, and you have maybe one or two other parties that are contesting the election, and all the other minor parties, the Greens, the Neos, are around 5%, maybe another party around 5%. But here we see five parties at around at least 10% of the vote, which is not really the case in all of the states in Austria. Many of the states you basically only have three parties that are really punching double digits, but Vienna is one where you have five parties that are able to reach that level. And the last thing I want to look at is the 2020 elections that happened in Vienna, just to get an idea about how significant this election is for the Freedom Party. Now, in 2015, Heinz-Christian Strache, the then leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, carried the party to a victory. They won around 25%. They came second place, but they did win around 25% of the vote. And sorry, that was in 2010. And in 2015, they had managed to reach around 30% of the vote. And Heinz-Christian Strache from the Freedom Party was from Vienna, so he did have somewhat of a local strength in this state and was able to bring the Freedom Party to 30%. And after the Ibiza scandal, they collapsed. They went from 30% to 7%, a drop in 23 points. This was one of the worst election disasters, collapses for the Freedom Party in the party's history. And of course, we can see that with this result now, they have somewhat recovered from those losses. They've gone from 20% back up, or from 7% back up to 20, but they're nowhere near where they were in 2015 with that 30.8%. And part of that has to do with the personnel change. Of course, when you have different leaders from different states, they might do stronger in some areas than they do in others. So it's it's still to be seen if the Freedom Party can manage to beat that record to get up to 30% again. But they did manage to recover a lot of their losses. We can also see that the Austrian People's Party in previous elections was able to come back. And may retake the position from the Freedom Party as the main opposition, the main right-wing party in the state. And even though Vienna is a city, even though many of the cities in many European countries don't really vote for more right-wing populist parties, Vienna is somewhat of an exception, and the Freedom Party has done well here. And the People's Party was actually able to overtake them and maybe buck that trend. But we can see now with this election that the People's Party the Freedom Party has retaken their position as the second largest party, as the opposition. And the Social Democrats have been very strong in the state. I mean, this is a state that is very stable for them. Even in the previous elections, going a few elections back, they've got at least around 40%. And then going back, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, there were times where the Social Democrats could, of course, easily win an absolute majority in this state. So that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to cover these results. They are very important because this will, there's not really a change in terms of what's going to happen. Vienna will have the same government, the same mayor, pretty much the same politics as it did before. And of course, this election won't impact Austrian politics directly that much, but it is another bellwether. It is another sign that the Freedom Party has been growing. It is maintaining its its support, and the People's Party is somewhat still collapsing. So it is still kind of a accurate data we can use to see where Austrian politics is right now. So that's going to be it for this video, and of course I will do some more shortly, probably the next few days, giving some updates on the polls in Romania and Poland for the presidential elections there. But that's going to be it for this video. I hope you all liked it. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.